The morning of my parents' 30th wedding anniversary, I woke up at 5 to make the quiche. Nobody asked me to. That was the thing nobody ever understood about me. I didn't wait to be asked, I just did things. I drove 40 minutes to the good grocery store in Millbrook because the one near my apartment didn't carry the Gruyere my mother liked. I grated the cheese by hand, I blind baked the crust. I arranged the whole thing in the ceramic dish she'd had since before I was born. The blue one with the small chip on the rim that she never threw away because my grandmother had given it to her. I set it on their kitchen counter at 7:15 in the morning and my mother didn't look up from her phone. "Your sister's flight lands at noon," she said. "Make sure you're here." I was already here. I had been here since 7. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I work as a licensed occupational therapist at a rehab center in Hartford, Connecticut. And for most of my adult life I operated under the quiet assumption that if I was just good enough, patient enough, useful enough, my family would eventually notice. It took me a long time to understand that some people don't notice. Not because they're blind. Because they've already decided what they're looking at. My sister's name is Adrian. She's 4 years older than me. She has our mother's cheekbones and our father's talent for walking into a room and making everyone feel like they'd been waiting for her. She works in marketing in Chicago, which mostly meant, as far as I could tell, that she attended a lot of events and posted photos of herself at rooftop bars. She called home every Sunday. She remembered everyone's birthdays. She was, in the vocabulary of our family, the one who had it together. I was the one who showed up with the quiche. The anniversary dinner was at my parents' house in Westport. My aunt and uncle came, a few of their close friends, my cousin Brooke, who I've always liked, and Adrian, who arrived at 12:40 with a rolling carry-on and a bottle of Barolo and immediately became the center of the room in the way she always did. Not aggressively, just effortlessly. The way the sun doesn't try to be the brightest thing in the sky. I refilled water glasses. I helped my mother carry the salad bowl. I sat at the far end of the table next to Brooke, and we talked quietly about her new job, while the rest of the table talked to Adrian. After dinner, my father stood up to give a toast. He talked about 30 years of marriage. He talked about the family they'd built. He got a little emotional, which surprised me, because my father was not a man who got emotional easily. And then he said he and my mother had something they wanted to give us, both of us, their daughters, as a way of marking the occasion. He reached under the table and pulled out 2 envelopes. He handed Adrian hers first. She opened it, and her hand went to her mouth. "Dad," she said, "this is too much. You've been working so hard," he said. "We want you to go somewhere beautiful, recharge." Inside the envelope was a check. I didn't see the number, but my aunt leaned over and Adrian showed her. And my aunt made a sound like she'd seen something wonderful. Then my father handed me mine. I opened it. Inside was a gift card to a spa in Stamford. $60, the kind of thing you pick up at a drugstore checkout while you're waiting in line. It still had the little sticker on the back that you scratch off to activate it. I looked at it for a moment. I was aware of my face and what it might be doing, so I kept it very still. "Thank you," I said. My mother nodded, already turning back to Adrian. Later, in the kitchen, I heard my father tell my uncle that Adrian was going to take a cruise through the Mediterranean. 2 weeks. He said the number, $22,000. I stood at the sink and finished washing the quiche dish and thought about how I had driven 40 minutes each way to buy Gruyere at 6:30 in the morning. The thing about growing up as the second daughter in my family is that you become an expert in invisible math. You count things without meaning to. The number of times your sister's name came up at dinner versus yours. The number of times someone asked how your job was going versus asked if you were seeing anyone, as if your professional life was a waiting room and your real life hadn't started yet. You don't do it to be bitter. You do it the way you breathe, automatically, just to know where you stand. By my calculation, I had been standing about 15 feet behind Adrian my entire life. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for a while. It was March. The streetlights had that winter quality where they seemed to be working too hard. I didn't cry. I was past the age where this kind of thing made me cry. I just sat with it. The way you sit with a low-grade headache you've had for so long you've stopped expecting it to go away. Then I went inside and checked my email. There was a message from an attorney in New Haven. It was regarding the estate of my maternal grandmother, Eleanor Marsh, who had died 4 months earlier at 89, quietly, in the assisted living facility where I had visited her every other Sunday for the last 6 years. My grandmother and I had a relationship that my family mostly didn't know about. Not because we hid it. Because nobody thought to ask. I was the one who drove her to her cardiologist appointments when my mother was busy. I was the one who sat with her through the long, tedious afternoons in her room and listened to her talk about her life. Her first apartment in Providence, the dress she wore when she met my grandfather, the way bread used to smell in the bakery on the corner of her childhood street. My family thought of these visits as chores I'd appointed myself. My grandmother thought of them as something else. She told me once, on a Tuesday afternoon in October when the light through her window was the color of old honey, that I reminded her of herself. Quiet, she said, but watching everything. The email said that my grandmother's will, which had been revised 8 months before her death, had left the majority of her estate to me. I read it 3 times. Then I called the attorney back the next morning and drove to New Haven that Thursday and sat across a desk from a man named Mr. Peterson, who had kind eyes and a methodical way of speaking, and he walked me through it. My grandmother had accumulated more than most people knew. There was the house in Madison that everyone thought she'd sold years ago. She had sold it, but the proceeds had gone into investments her financial advisor had managed quietly for decades. There were savings accounts. There were bonds. There were assets my own parents hadn't been aware of because my grandmother had not been a woman who discussed her finances with people who didn't ask. The total, after taxes and legal fees, was going to come to approximately $460,000. I sat in Mr. Peterson's office and looked at the number on the document in front of me and felt something shift inside me. Not excitement, not triumph. Something quieter and stranger. Like a long-held breath finally released. I thanked him. I shook his hand. I drove home on I-95 and stopped at a rest stop and ordered a coffee and sat at a plastic table and thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. This is the part where I made a decision that people who heard the story later kept questioning. They wanted to know why I told my family. Here's why: I didn't at first. For 3 months I said nothing. I worked with Mr. Peterson to manage the transfer carefully. I opened a separate account. I had a conversation with a financial advisor my grandmother's attorney recommended, a woman named Ms. Park who had a calm, precise manner and no tolerance for vague thinking, and I started to understand what I had and what it meant and what I could do with it. I also, during those 3 months, started keeping records. I wasn't angry, I want to be clear about that. I wasn't scheming. Not in the dramatic way that word implies. I was just paying attention, with more intention than I had before. I started writing things down. When my mother called and asked me to cover a household expense for them because they were tight that month, I wrote it down. When my father mentioned casually that they'd helped Adrian with first and last month's rent when she moved to Chicago, $3,800, he said it like a footnote. I wrote it down. When my aunt mentioned at Easter that my parents had co-signed a loan for Adrian 3 years ago, which I had not known, I wrote it down. I was not building a case. I was just finally deciding to see clearly. In June, my cousin Brooke mentioned that Adrian had told her about the inheritance. I didn't confirm it. I asked Brooke who had told her, and she said Adrian had heard it from my mother, who had apparently gone through some of my grandmother's papers that she had access to as executor of a smaller, earlier portion of the estate, and had found a reference to the revised will. 2 days later, my mother called me. "We need to talk about Grandma's estate," she said. Her voice had a quality I recognized. Careful, measured, the way she got when she was arranging something. "Okay," I said. "Your father and I were thinking it might make sense to sit down together. As a family. You, me, Dad, Adrian, just to talk through everything." "Talk through what specifically?" I asked. "Well," she said, and paused. "Grandma always meant for the family to benefit. All of us. I think she would have wanted, Mom, I said. I'll come for dinner on Saturday. I'll come for dinner on Saturday. We can talk then. I wasn't afraid of the conversation. That was new. I arrived on Saturday with a bottle of wine and a very clear head. Adrian was already there. My father made pasta. My mother had made a salad. It felt almost normal until we sat down and the food was on the table and my father cleared his throat. We've been thinking, he said, that this inheritance situation is something we should handle as a family. It's not a situation, I said pleasantly. It's a will. Grandma revised it 8 months before she died. Mr. Peterson has explained everything. It's all very straightforward. My mother folded her hands on the table. Claire, you have to understand how this looks. Your grandmother was elderly. She wasn't always. She was sharp until the day she died, I said. Mr. Peterson can confirm that. Her doctor can confirm that. I have records of our conversations going back 4 years. Silence. Adrian, to her credit, didn't say much at first. She looked at her plate. It was my mother who pushed. This isn't what Grandma would have wanted, to divide the family. Grandma made her wishes very clear, I said. She had an attorney draw up a legal document. I think that's actually the least ambiguous way a person can express what they want. My father tried a different angle. He talked about fairness. He talked about the fact that Adrian had student loans. He talked about how they were looking at refinancing the house, and it had been a hard couple of years. Each thing he said I recognized, because I had written it down. Every financial difficulty they'd ever mentioned to me. Every time they'd asked me for something small or large, all of it had accumulated in a document on my laptop that I had never intended to use as a weapon, but had always known I might need to understand. I know it's been hard, I said. I also know that over the last 6 years I've contributed approximately $14,000 to this family, covering expenses, helping with repairs, paying for things when asked, while also being the person who drove Grandma to her appointments every other week for 4 years, sat with her on Sunday afternoons, and was with her the night she had the episode in February that we were afraid might be the end. Nobody asked me to do those things. I did them because I loved her, and I think she knew that. And I think that's why she made the decision she made. The table was very quiet. That's not, my mother started. I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it. I'm not here to fight. But I need you to hear me when I tell you that I am not going to renegotiate a legal document because it's inconvenient. Adrian looked up. There was something complicated in her expression. She said quietly, Mom, stop. My mother looked at her. She's right, Adrian said. Grandma made a choice. We don't have to like it. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't an apology. But it was something, and I filed it away. What happened next was my mother's idea, and it was the mistake that changed everything. 2 weeks later, she called me and asked if I could come to dinner at a new restaurant they'd found in Westport. Just the 4 of us, a chance to reconnect, she said. No more talk about the estate. I agreed. I had no reason not to. The restaurant was nice. We ordered drinks. We talked about ordinary things for 20 minutes. And then my mother said she'd been speaking to a friend who was an attorney, and she'd learned that in certain cases where undue influence could be demonstrated. I put down my glass. Mom, I said carefully, are you telling me you're planning to contest the will? She looked at my father. We just think, he said, that it's worth exploring. I looked at both of them. I thought about the 16 Sundays every year for 6 years that I had spent in a room in an assisted living facility in Orange, Connecticut, listening to my grandmother talk about her life because I wanted to know who she was before the world reduced her to an old woman in a chair. I thought about the night in February when I had driven through a sleet storm at 2 in the morning because the night nurse had called me, not my mother, me, because I was listed as the emergency contact. And I had sat in that room and held my grandmother's hand while they stabilized her. And I had not called my mother until the morning because there was nothing she could have done, and I knew she wouldn't come anyway. I thought about the quiche I had made in March with Gruyere from Millbrook and the $60 spa gift card still sitting on my kitchen counter, still activated, never used. I'd like you to think very carefully about that, I said. Because I have documentation of every visit I made to Grandma over the last 6 years. I have records of every expense I've covered for this family. I have her letters to me, handwritten, going back 4 years, in which she is quite clear about her affection and her intentions. And I have a doctor's assessment confirming her capacity at the time the will was revised. Mr. Peterson was thorough. Grandma was thorough. If you want to go to court, we can go to court, but I want you to know what that will look like. My mother opened her mouth. My father put his hand on her arm. They did not pursue the will contest. What they did instead, over the following 3 months, was a slow and comprehensive withdrawal of goodwill that I think they expected to hurt me more than it did. My mother stopped calling. My father became curt on the rare occasions we spoke. Adrian texted me once to say she was sorry about how things had gone and that she wasn't really involved, which was mostly true. I used some of the inheritance to pay off my student loans. I put a significant portion into a high-yield account on Ms. Park's recommendation. I took a week off in September and drove up the Maine coast alone and ate lobster rolls and read 3 novels and walked on rocky beaches in the mornings and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was living in a life that belonged to me. I also, that September, started putting together something I had been thinking about for a while. My grandmother's financial advisor had mentioned, during one of our early meetings, that my grandmother had been meticulous. She had kept records of everything, including, as it turned out, a ledger of every financial interaction she'd had with her family over the years, who she had helped, when, how much. It was not a vindictive document. It was just how she kept track, and it showed clearly and quietly that in the last decade of her life she had lent my parents $43,000 across several occasions, none of which had been repaid. She had never asked for repayment. She had never mentioned it, but she had written it down. I did not use this information to demand repayment. It was not mine to demand. But I understood it. I understood what my grandmother had seen, and what she had concluded, and why she had made the choice she'd made. She had not been confused. She had been paying attention, the way quiet people do, tracking everything, saying nothing, waiting for the right moment to make the only statement that couldn't be interrupted or dismissed or reframed. The will was the last thing she ever said to our family, and she said it in the most permanent language available to her. By November, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 2 days later and I picked up. She said she wanted to apologize. She said things had been hard. She said she knew they hadn't always been fair to me, hadn't always seen me clearly, and she was sorry for that. Her voice was tired. I believe that she meant it, or some version of it, the version that people mean when regret and self-interest are so tangled together you can't separate them cleanly. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "We were hoping," she started. "Mom," I said, "I forgive you. I want you to know that. But I also need you to understand that forgiveness isn't the same as going back to the way things were. I'm not available to be the person I used to be in this family. I can love you and still need things to be different." She was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean, practically?" she asked. "It means I'm not covering expenses anymore. It means I need to be treated like an adult whose choices in work and time are worth something. It means if Adrian gets something, I'm not standing there with a drugstore gift card pretending everything is fine." Another silence. "That's fair," she said, not warmly. But she said it. Things did not transform overnight. They are not transformed now. My father and I have a relationship that is cordial and careful. Like two people sharing an elevator who have agreed not to discuss the obvious. My mother calls more often and listens more, though there are still moments when I can feel her defaulting to the old pattern, ranking things, centering Adrian, editing me to a smaller size. I notice it. I don't fight it every time. Some battles are not worth the energy, and I have learned, slowly and not without difficulty, to spend my energy on things that grow. Adrian and I have dinner when she's in town. She is not villainous. She was handed a role at birth and she played it, the way most of us play the roles we're handed when we're too young to question the casting. We are building something. Carefully. I do not know yet what it will become. What I know is this. My grandmother sat in a room for the last years of her life and watched her family the way she'd watched everything, quietly, completely, without announcing herself. She chose me not because she was confused or manipulated or lonely. She chose me because she saw me, because she knew that the person refilling the water glasses and driving 40 minutes for the right cheese and sitting in a sleet storm at 2 in the morning is not invisible. She is just waiting for the world to catch up to what she already knows about herself. I have her letters in a box in my closet. I read them sometimes, not for comfort exactly, but for calibration. To remember what it feels like to be known by someone who was paying attention. She signed all of them the same way. Not love, Grandma. Not take care. She signed them keep going, Eleanor. Like she was writing to herself. Like she was writing to me. Like she knew we were the same. I used to think patience was something you were born with or you weren't. That some people just had a longer fuse, a softer reaction, a quieter way of moving through things that hurt. I don't believe that anymore. I think patience is something you build, slowly, out of the only material available to you when you're young and powerless and watching, and that material is attention. You pay attention long enough, carefully enough, and eventually you start to understand the shape of things, why they are the way they are, what they're actually made of. My grandmother Eleanor understood this. She sat in a room for the last years of her life and she watched her family with clear eyes, and she made a decision that nobody saw coming because nobody thought to look at what she was seeing. They were busy looking at what was easy, the daughter who filled a room, the son-in-law who told good stories. They weren't watching the one who drove through sleet at 2 in the morning. They weren't reading the letters. They weren't tracking what was real. That's the thing about cruelty that's quiet and long, and delivered in small doses. A gift card instead of a check, a chair at the far end of the table, a name left off a conversation. It doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It announces itself as just the way things are, and if you accept that framing, if you internalize it young enough, you start to believe that you are the problem, that the smallness you're handed is the accurate size of you. I believed that for a long time. Not completely, not consciously, but enough that I kept filling water glasses and driving to Millbrook for cheese and showing up with the quiche that nobody acknowledged, hoping that eventually the gesture would be large enough to be seen. It wasn't a character flaw, it was what I'd been taught, and I don't say that to excuse it, only to understand it, because understanding it is what finally let me put it down. What changed me wasn't the inheritance. The money was a fact, a legal document, a number on a page. What changed me was reading my grandmother's letters and recognizing someone I had always been but never had permission to name. Someone who noticed everything and said nothing and waited. Someone whose power wasn't loud. It was just true. Integrity, I've come to think, isn't about making dramatic stands. It's about the accumulation of small honest choices when nobody is watching and nothing is at stake yet. It's about driving to Millbrook, because the cheese matters, because your grandmother's birthday matters, because the person in the chair by the window matters even when the rest of the world has moved on. Those choices compound, they become a record, and eventually that record speaks on your behalf in ways you never planned and cannot manufacture. That's not luck, that's not coincidence, that's what it looks like when the life you actually lived catches up to the moment that asks who you are. I am Claire. I drove through sleet, I grated the cheese by hand, I showed up, keep going,